Welcome to Casual Friday. This week I'm going to talk about my plans for Finish It February, and then I will update you on my works in progress. Finish It February is a time of year when you can sort of plan that you're going to address your pile of UFOs, that is your unfinished objects. So last year in Finish It February, I talked quite a bit about the evolution of my sort of knitting organization and how I have my knitting office set up. So if you're interested in that, I'll link up there. But because of doing Casual Fridays every week in 2018, at the beginning of 2019, I really didn't think that I was going to have much in the way of unfinished projects to take care of in February. It's because of Casual Fridays that I thought that, because I sort of feel accountable to, as I show you my works in progress each week, that I want to finish them and then show them. So I just kind of felt like I never got into that situation where I put projects to the side and then left them the way I have historically done throughout my knitting life. So as I was preparing for this video, and I thought, okay, I wrote down my list of unfinished projects, and I really thought I only had about 5 of them, most of which were very small and would take maybe an hour, maybe a half a day to complete. So my plan was, oh, well, since I don't have that many projects, I'm going to use Finish It February to address a room I have down in the basement that I call the craft room. Or alternatively, I call it the pit of despair, because it just becomes a dumping ground for any sort of craft related thing that I don't want to keep in my knitting office, because I have a very small knitting office. And it just gets worse and worse. The lighting is terrible. And so I thought that that was what I was going to be doing in the majority of February this year, would be addressing that room, getting it organized, taking my sewing machine in to get serviced, and putting new lighting in the ceiling so that I'd want to be down there occasionally anyway. So I thought that was mostly what I was going to do. As it turns out, I have way more unfinished projects than I thought I have, which is kind of the point of Finish It February. The point is to really pull out all of your unfinished objects so you can actually see what they are and then make decisions about whether or not you ever want to finish them, whether you want to finish them but maybe not until some later time, or if you want to finish them now. But a lot of it is just to remind yourself of what it is that you have that's there. So let me show you what I knew I had, and then let me show you what I discovered I had that I completely forgot about. Well, one of the things was the project I'm currently working on actively, which is my Edwardian sweater. And then the second thing is the Aran sweater that I've been designing, but I haven't really made any progress on because I need to start over on it. So those were like the 2 main projects that I really was aware of. The third project was this red scarf that I sort of acquired a couple of weeks ago, that had been started by an acquaintance of mine, Karen, who did a lot of charity knitting, and she died a few years ago, leaving a number of unfinished charity projects, and I decided to take this one on. So I've completed the knitting on it. I was short a couple of rows, having enough yarn to finish the last couple of rows, and I was trying to decide what to do with that. So I put this aside for a week while I thought about how I can finish this scarf so that it will be lovely and usable for whoever gets it. So the fourth thing is a hat. It's an 1898 hat. Now I've made 3 of these hats in the past, and I wanted to make one for myself. And so far I've done the headband. It's got these little ear flaps down there, and I'm at the point where I need to graft the start to the end and then pick up stitches around this long edge in order to create the crown of the hat. And I stopped because I want to make a video of the process of grafting as well as picking up the stitches, because that causes confusion for a number of people, and it's taken me making several of these hats for me to come up with what I find is the best way to achieve the finish that I want. So I've just been putting off doing these videos, and so the hat has been at this point. I really like this. This yarn is yarn that I dyed myself at a knitting retreat a couple of years ago, and I've really been wanting to use it. I dyed it specifically for the intent that I would be making a hat for myself. So I wanted to use this yarn. It's sort of an unfinished object, ultimate unfinished object. And so in the next week or so, I'm going to be finishing this hat. So that's 4 things. And then I made this bootie, this little dino bootie. I think in December, my niece is expecting a baby that will be due this month. And as is often true for me when it comes to booties, I make one bootie and then I don't make the second. But this is really, really, really cute. And I want to make the second one and send them off to her soon, because the baby's due sometime this month. Then I knew that I had been working on a pair of socks for my brother. And this has been a number of months since I put these to the side. And I think what happened was I had gotten one sock done. He has very large feet. I call him Sasquatch. Oh, and I haven't done the toe on this, so I probably am intending to do a contrast color for the toe. I used a heel called the strong heel. It's called the strong heel when you do it cuff down. It's called something else when you do it toe up, but structurally it's identical. So I'd done the sock except for the toe, and then I'd done the second one, and I realized that the gauge on the foot had gotten loose. I must have just relaxed a lot, and so I need to rip the foot back on this sock and re-knit it. And that's the kind of thing where I'm like, oh, I'll just put it to the side and think about it later. So this is number 6, and I thought that was all I had. So what I did was I thought, I'll just make sure. I didn't go looking in any bins or bags or anything, because I was pretty sure that's all I had. So then I went and looked in my Ravelry notebook, because every time I start a project, I create a project page for that project. And so I looked at everything that had a status of WIP, WIP, works in progress. And I saw that there were 14. And a lot of them don't have pictures, because a lot of times I don't take pictures while I'm knitting them. But I took a look at what they all were, and there were 14 projects, not 6. So this is why I do finish in February. I want to make sure I actually know what I have that's unfinished and then make decisions about them. It turns out I actually had 2 pairs of socks that I was working on for my brother. Again, because he has very big feet, I always worry about having enough yarn. So I had knit this pair of socks with a contrast heel, and it looks like I have most of the leg done on a second sock. I have, it's coming off the needles. So I'll have to really look carefully at this and see where I am compared to the first one. But this was a total surprise to me. Once I saw it on my project page and I saw that there were 2 different ones, I went and looked in my office. It was on the floor underneath something, and I had just forgotten about it. Then it turns out I have a 3rd pair of socks that I had started, and these were for me. And I was using this colorway that I really wasn't a huge fan of, and I wasn't sure. I wasn't loving it at the time, and I still don't love it, but I don't really hate it. I actually think it's not bad. So I will probably finish this at some point. I doubt that I'll be able to finish it this month, but we'll see. Then I was surprised to see that I had 2 pairs of mittens I hadn't finished. I kind of knew that there was one, because it's always the first one in my unfinished projects pictures in my Ravelry notebook. But it turned out I actually have 2 pairs of mittens, and I think they're even knit. If they weren't knit with the same yarn, they were knit with a yarn that's very close in color. So the first pair of mittens, and the mittens are actually knit, but the projects aren't complete. So here's the one pair of mittens. And what's not complete about them is that my intention was to line them with fleece. And so I did make a fleece lining for one of them, which has not been sewn in. but I have not done it for the second one. This honestly is going to take like half an hour to make the other lining and then sew them in. And I think I knit these 3 years ago, 4 years. It's ridiculous. So I did pull these out last year, finish it February, but I was busy actually knitting and finishing other things. And then by the time I got to the end of February, I lost interest. So then I have another pair of mittens. These are plain mittens. These are mittens that I might give to a charity or something, but it's a plain pair of mittens that has some ends that need to be woven in. And this one has a lining in it. It's actually been sewn in, and this one doesn't. And I think I knit these mittens in order to show the process of how to line a mitten. I'd done a video on that, and because that was why I knit those mittens, I just never felt the need to complete them. Number 10 is the second sock of a pair of socks. These have been carried through a number of Finish It Februaries or Finish It years. They're very simple cables, boring to knit, and so I just have never bit the bullet and actually finished the socks. So these are sitting there. At some point I'll finish them. Whether it'll be this year or not, I don't know. This next project is one that I am just going to take off my list as not really a project. Originally, I started it thinking I would get to a certain point in it and that I would create a pattern for it. I originally designed it in order to do some videos on my YouTube channel on stranded colorwork, which I did last summer. But I continued on and using it for teaching. And it's not, as it is, it can't be used as the way that I intended for this particular project. So I might go back at some point and actually create a cowl pattern for this. But as the state that this is in right now, it's not something that I'm going to finish as a project. So I'm going to eliminate that one from my list of UFOs. Now, the last one was one that I looked at on my Ravelry notebook and thought, oh, you know what, I'm going to just rip all that out and maybe use that yarn for my next vintage sweater. And then I pulled it out of the bin and I thought, ooh, I really like this. I stopped where I was in it. I'm using a hand-painted yarn. So this is the sweater. This is the back. So this little motif at the top of the back of the sweater, just for the back. And then this is the waistband, and it has these kind of cables. And I had this idea for what I wanted to do with this, and I still really like my idea. The problem was with the knitting in this. You can see right in the middle of the back where I switched to a new skein of the yarn, and it's distinctly different. So I knew I was going to have to rip that back out and then find a way to combine, alternate between two different skeins for a while and gradually do it, or I just didn't know. And I put this aside. It's been put it to the side for a couple of years now. So I still really like the idea. I might decide to use this idea in a different sweater, and I might decide to use this yarn for a different purpose, but I'm not going to just dismiss this completely. So this is something where I'm like, oh, this is something I do want to deal with, just not now. So as I've demonstrated, I am usually not really aware of how many unfinished things I have. I really did think I only had a handful of things, and it turned out I had 14. So this is why I do this. This is why I just let me look and see what I have so that I can become aware of it and I can then decide what to do. What I like about the concept of Finish It February, whether I do it in February or I do it in some other way, is just this idea of really checking in with what I have and being aware of it. Because a lot of times I find things that I've totally forgotten about and I really like. And I really liked having that reminder. So if this is something you're interested in, I would encourage you to just pull out every project bag and project you have stuffed in a bin or a box and just look at all of it and make an assessment of it. You don't have to take care of all of it. You certainly don't have to do it this month or ever, but it is a nice idea to just be aware of what you have and decide what you want to do about it, whether it means finishing it, whether it means throwing it away, whether it means ripping it out, or just, oh, I'm glad I'm reminded of this. I'll want to take care of this sometime in the future, just not right now. Okay, so here we are back again with my Edwardian sweater. So last week I had the whole body done. This week I have the first sleeve done. Let me see if I can turn it. It's not sewn up or anything. I have it just stuck into the dress form here using some T-pins. But here is the first sleeve. So the ribbing on this sleeve cuff is quite long, and it was worked. This is worsted weight yarn. It was worked on needles that were the double-aught needles, which is 1.75 millimeters. That's the same size needle that I'm using to work the neck. It is the same size needle that was called for the bottom ribbing. I chose to use a 2.5 millimeter needle instead. The ribbing is also a little different. It's knit 2, purl 2 rather than knit 1, purl 1. And I just wanted something that was slightly looser, because in order for it to go around my non-Edwardian corseted body, I wanted to be able to get it finished. So I'd figured out last week that this fabric, the way that this fabric is structured, where it's kind of this zigzaggy accordion-like fabric, the back side of this piece of fabric and the back side of this piece are actually at 90 degrees to the body, and they face each other. And the instructions are calling for facing those pieces of fabric with ribbon and then attaching buttons and buttonholes to the ribbon. And so I've been thinking about that and what kind of a chore that it's going to be to create buttonholes, enough buttons and buttonholes to attach this all the way down so it doesn't gape open. And just what a chore it's going to be to actually button the buttons all the way down here. And so I was thinking about maybe using snaps. So my thought was it might work well to use snap tape. Now in the UK they have a different name for snaps. I think they call them something like press studs, something like that. We call them snaps in the United States, and I'm sure they have other names for them in different other places. But there is this kind of cloth tape that you can get that has them snaps attached at intervals, so that you can just sew the tape to the inside of the fabric. And I was thinking that might work. From what I'm seeing online, that tape comes in white and black, and I'm not sure that's what I want to use. So my other option would be to get ribbon like the pattern calls for, but then to attach the snaps to the ribbon myself, create my own snap tape. Maybe that would work. So that's another option I'm thinking of. But I wanted to see if snaps were, I didn't know when snaps were invented. So I looked that up, and it turns out they were invented in 1885 by some guy in Germany. So they had been invented by the time the sweater was designed in 1904. They were originally, the use was for men's trousers. So when I was looking up in Wikipedia about the history of snaps, they mentioned that, there's this company that makes knitting equipment. Is it Prime or Prime? Prym. It's a German company, and they've been making snaps since. They make knitting needles, and they make all kinds of sewing notions and things. They've been making snaps since 1903. So it's clear that, that snaps have been made, for a long time. It's not so clear as whether they were ever used in women's clothing at that time. I know that hooks and eyes were pretty common. The thing is with this particular sweater, because the two things that have to have either the snaps or hooks and eyes or buttons are facing each other perpendicular to the body like that, rather than being sort of parallel to each other, I don't think a hook and eye would work. I think hook and eye works when the two pieces are on the same plane and you want to attach the edge like that. And these are like this, and they need to go like this. So that's why buttons would work, or maybe snaps. So I thought I would look up in old newspapers to see if they advertised sewing notions, like if snaps for clothing were ever mentioned in the newspaper, just to see. So what I found, which was I did not expect, was that the term clothing snap meant something quite different than what I think of. Like for me, a clothing snap is the snap that you use in clothing. And obviously the word snap has other meanings. You could say snap your fingers like that, or it's a snap, meaning it's easy. So there's a lot of meanings to the word snap that we have today. What I found in the newspaper was, when I looked up clothing snap, was they seemed to have that word was used as a to mean like a sale on something. And so they were like snap, and then they would tell you what the sale was going to be, and the men's suits that are normally all these different prices are going to be $6.33, and come in early, and they'll tell you the dates of when the sale was going to be. And they say, come in early, because otherwise the sizes will be broken, meaning, you're not going to have every size. And this is going to be the best snap of the year. And then I looked up in Merriam-Webster, using this term snap to mean sale, I was just trying to understand sort of the history of it. But one of the examples they used in all of the different versions of how the word snap could be used was that customers were snapping up the sale items. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if those two things are related, like that they were called, they're snapping up something as a way, if that's related to calling a sale a snap. I don't know. But it was an interesting thing to find out, that I'd never heard the term snap be used in that way. I still don't know about whether they were ever advertised in the newspaper back then as a sewing notion or not. I'm going to keep looking and see if I can find anything. So, but anyway, my plan is to try to use snaps on this Edwardian sweater rather than to do buttons and buttonholes. So I continue to look at vintage knitting patterns, and I've been exploring books on knitting techniques that may have been published in the 19th century and early 20th century. I'm interested in finding when certain techniques were written into these books in more refined ways. And what I mean by that is that, for example, in this Edwardian sweater, it calls for using short rows. And short rows are when you only work across some of the stitches, and then you turn around and you work back in the other direction. And it's a vertical shaping technique that allows some of the stitches on the needles to have more rows than other stitches. So it allows you to shape something vertically the same way that you'd shape something horizontally by increasing or decreasing. So the most basic way of doing a short row is, like I said, just work across some of the stitches, turn, and then work back in the other direction. And that's how the instructions are written for this Edwardian sweater. So I've been looking at other patterns that call for short rows, and as I was looking through the decades and to see when, say, short row shaping was introduced, I noticed that the shaping for shoulders was done using the stair-step technique, where you'd bind off a few stitches at the beginning of the row, every other row for several rows, so that you can create a slope for the shoulders. That was something I was interested in finding out. When did shoulder shaping come into play, and how were they describing to do it? And one of the methods was same as is often used today, is with these stair steps. But more often today, you will see short row shaping done instead, so that you get a smoother edge and it's easier to seam, or so that you can do a 3-needle bind off. You can join the two pieces together with a 3-needle bind off and not have to sew at all. So what I was noticing is that when short row shaping was introduced into the patterns that I have found so far that have short row shaping in the shoulders, that they're not calling for a technique to be applied to the short row shaping. They're just saying to turn and go back the other way. But I did begin to wonder about when short row techniques may have first begun to be used. Like, were they known prior to this, or did they always just turn and work the other direction? So I've been trying to find knitting technique books that may have described them. And I thought, you know, who might know is my friend Ole Petter, who is from Sweden, and he did his master's degree on stranded colorwork, or he calls it multicolor knitting, where you're alternating between you know, 2 or more colors in a particular row. And he was the person who I learned about the term rotating floats from, and did some videos on stranded color work that talked about those different things. But the way that Ole Petter did his master's thesis was by looking at 600 different knitting manuals and finding which ones described how to work stranded color work, and which ones, and if they did they describe explicitly how to do it. He's trying to determine whether the way people are doing it traditionally now, if they were influenced by what was in the book, or if the books were influenced by the way people were actually doing it. If he could determine what was a regionally specific tradition, if that was possible. So I knew he had looked through 600 knitting manuals, and so I emailed him and I said, did you notice anything in there about other kinds of techniques, like, say, short row turns? And he wrote back and said no, he was only focused on the stranded color work. He made some comments that I thought were really interesting and that I want to explore a little more. And what he talked about was that those sort of written down knitting patterns and those knitting books would have been for the bourgeois knitters. And which is kind of how I had been thinking of just people with more money who were learning to knit, like they weren't brought up learning to knit. Knitting patterns were developed in the middle of the 19th century for women who were in the middle class in the Victorian era, and that was something that they took up and needed to learn. And so they had to have patterns written for them, and that's how they learned to knit. They weren't like the poorer people who grew up learning how to knit and were knitting because they needed to clothe their families and were also earning extra money. So there's this, I was kind of aware that when I was finding knitting patterns in newspapers, they were big city newspapers, and they were describing knitting sweaters for activities that only people with money would be participating in. So I had been kind of seeing that that was probably why that kind of knitting, the knitting patterns, were so influenced by dressmaking techniques, whereas the knitting that poorer people did that maybe was more ingeniously constructed, seamlessly and in specific ways, why those two things didn't intercept more. But when he described it as the bourgeois knitters, and then he said, for lack of a better term, the peasant knitters, they made different types of garments. They were, and they were using other techniques like fulling and, other kinds of things that weren't necessarily what the people who were knitting from patterns were doing. So I thought that was a really interesting distinction. And it was one I'd been kind of forming in my head, but he just he stated it in a way that made me really sort of understand that there was probably a real division of not only types of knitting, but types of knitters. And he was describing the situation, in Sweden in maybe the earlier 20th century. And it reminded me of what I'd been learning when I was studying Bavarian traveling twisted stitch patterns. I really love those kinds of stitch patterns. They are traditional stitch patterns of the Ennstall Valley in Austria and Bavaria. And when I say traditional knitting pattern, I mean a true tradition. it was not a tradition that was sort of invented in the 20th century for sweaters, the way a lot of the traditional knitting that we know today is sort of marketed to appeal in a fashion sense, like the Aran sweater, and the way Norwegian sweaters, the classic Norwegian sweater, is really a mid-century development. Icelandic sweaters, really like the 1950s and 60s. So, but Bavarian traveling twisted stitch patterns were these really intricate traveling, they're like miniature cables, but they have one stitch crossing one stitch, and all the knit stitches are knit through the back loop so that they're twisted. It creates these beautiful embossed designs. And they were originally knit on men's stockings starting in like the 17th, 18th century. And that's what men of that region wore. And it was part of what was called their national costume. And it was when I got this email from Ole Petter that I started thinking about these national costumes and what that even meant. Because in the United States, we don't have that. But we do have people who are descended from immigrants from different places. And when they have their festivals, they wear these traditional costumes. And I've never really quite understood it because I don't have that kind of heritage at all. So this national costume, this costume of the peasantry, they were required to wear those. Like they had to wear the stockings, and eventually the women, their stockings were used some of the same stitch patterns, but their stockings were made of white cotton instead of sort of a natural color wool. And they had a lot more stockinette in them, and they had some lace patterning as well as the traveling twisted stitch patterns in them. But for both, that was part of their national costume that they were required to wear. And at some point, fashions changed in the 19th century, and men were wearing trousers instead of lederhosen or knee pants, and women were wearing different types of skirts. Just fashions changed. So those patterns started to really die out, and it was because of these two women who were collecting these patterns and then put them in these stitch dictionaries that we have today. They really wanted to preserve these stitch patterns. So I started thinking about, well, what are these, what does this even mean, a national costume or a regional costume? Because I don't really have any experience with it, I started looking it up. And from what I'm reading, like in medieval times, when certain people who were not aristocratic or nobility, maybe they had money, like they were making money, they were not allowed to wear certain types of clothing. Like you couldn't dress better than the nobility. You couldn't dress as well or better than the nobility. Just because you could afford it, you weren't allowed to do that. And here in the United States, when the Puritans and the Pilgrims first came here, they had these rules about you had to make a certain amount of money, otherwise you weren't allowed to wear ruffles, or you weren't allowed to do this or that or the other thing. And those laws pretty much fell by the wayside pretty quickly. But those types of laws were still enforced in Europe, apparently. And these are based on, they call them sumptuary laws, where they're laws that regulate consumption. So in terms of clothing, they were regulating what kind of clothing you could wear, what kinds of things embellishments you could have on your clothing. In some places today, there still are laws about what men and women can wear, especially, and then we have laws here in the United States about with uniforms. Like you can't impersonate, say, police officer. So you can't just dress up in a police officer's uniform and pretend that you are a police officer. And in some countries, they have certain like sashes that everybody is required to wear, but what color your sash is indicates whether you are of a religious order, or if you were just of a certain status, or if you're just a regular person. And so these are sort of visual labels of who you are. And that's what the national costumes were. And all of that just came from Ole Petter saying these terms, bourgeois knitter versus peasant knitter. And he's like, just for lack of better terms. So this is just one more thing that I'm finding really interested in terms of the knitting history and just general social history, and how certain types of knitting traditions or certain types of the ways techniques were used would have appeared in different parts of society based on when and how and why certain people learned to knit, particularly in the 19th century or early 20th century. So I'm just going to continue to plug away and see if I can understand more about this sort of division of knitting social classes and when they may have merged more together in the 20th century as knitting became more and more a leisure activity and less an economic necessity for people, because I really think that was what was dividing it. But again, not a knitting history expert, just a student. That's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any questions or comments about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.